Now let's bring in MS Now senior White House reporter Vaughn Hilliard, MS Now senior national security reporter David Rohde, foreign affairs journalist and author of Cosmopolitics on Substack, Elise Lavitt, and former senior advisor for Arab-Israeli negotiations at the U.S. State Department, Aaron David Miller. He's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. My thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon. Vaughn, I'll start with you. And the backdrop, of course, to Graham's funeral is who's in attendance. And we just saw President Trump. We didn't get an image yet of Prime Minister Netanyahu or President Zelensky. But it's fitting that they would be there, and really a remarkable scene that they would each have their separate audiences at the White House earlier today, ahead of that funeral, with President Trump. And they come in with very different sort of agendas and, frankly, very different standings in the president's eyes. Walk us through what we know about how those meetings went earlier today.
And they were separated by just mere minutes at the Oval Office. Essentially, one motorcade left, that of Zelensky, and then Netanyahu's arrived before the funeral. And I think we should be clear that this is coming at a time in which both of these conflicts here are colliding with one another. And Donald Trump, the American president, is watching the situation in which the U.S. military, as well as its financial contributions to both of these war efforts, are becoming entangled and difficult to extract from. And that is because, Russia, or because Ukrainian President Zelensky, part of his pitch here to President Trump was not only about licenses to build their own Patriot missile interceptors, but this was also comes just days after the Ukrainians struck an Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea. Iran has long supplied Russia with long-range drones, and this was an offensive attack on the part of the Ukrainians, and a clear message sent that these are two wars are becoming interlinked, and that Zelensky was also going to provide intelligence to Trump that suggested that Russia was behind striking U.S. military bases in the Middle East. And so the president then was meeting with Bibi Netanyahu, who has been clear from the outset of this war, but also the attacks last summer in 2025, that he wants the U.S. to continue its military offensive campaign. This morning on Fox and Friends, in a phone interview, the president was dismissive of Israeli intelligence suggesting that there was new nuclear facility construction underway in the Pixax Mountains, and the president suggesting that Israeli intelligence was put out there publicly just so that the U.S. would stay in the war with them. And so he's interlinked in all of this here now. And in so many ways, both men, they need the U.S. president. And the question is, what does he do?
So, David Rohde, let's spend a moment on Ukraine first. And in particular, Zelensky comes in here with some momentum. We know that President Trump likes to associate himself with winners. He has spent the majority of the last couple of years being very critical of Zelensky, blames him for his first impeachment back in 2019. But here, as Ukraine has showed remarkable resilience and remarkable advancements in drone technologies that the U.S. would be wise to connect with, it seems like Trump, at least in terms of rhetoric, a lot warmer. What was Zelensky's pitch today?
He specifically wants Patriot missiles, anti-defense missiles. It's not clear he's going to get those. There was, I think, nearly 400 drones that Russia fired just last night on various Ukrainian cities. But this is the strongest position Zelensky's ever been. This is the best moment, as you said, in terms of his relationship with Trump. And it's because of Ukraine's success on the battlefield. And it's interesting. In a way, if you look at Graham, he supported both wars. People criticize Graham for backing the Iran war so much. But Ukraine was the right bet here, in that Ukraine is performing very well. It was interesting to hear Vice President J.D. Vance talking about Graham in a positive way, but they bitterly disagreed over Ukraine. J.D. Vance and Donald Trump were very much, Ukraine's a waste of time, and literally, and I found an old story about it, but in 2024, Vance said, Ukraine doesn't have enough soldiers to sort of halt Russia or drive their soldiers out. And publicly, Graham calls him out and says, that's garbage. Come with me on one of my trips to Ukraine. Come to Ukraine, see this military, talk to Ukrainians. And I want to give Graham credit because he traveled the world. We were talking about before we started. He's from this little town of South Carolina, literally called Central. And he becomes this enormous figure in, international policy that I don't think will be easily replaced. But just this moment makes me just think of how wrong essentially the Trump administration and J.D. Vance have been on Ukraine. And then, to be fair, I think they were wrong about, and so was Graham, wrong about how easy it would be to defeat Iran.
Yeah, Graham made so many trips to Ukraine. In fact, he had just returned from Kyiv the weekend before he died. At least, speak to us, if you will, just about this remarkable evolution that the Zelensky-Trump relationship has taken. It was not that many months ago, not even a year and a half ago, where Trump and J.D. Vance dressed Zelensky down in the Oval Office, berated him for not being grateful, and threw him out. He and the Ukrainian delegation had to leave the White House. They didn't even get to have the lunch that was sitting there waiting for him. And look, we know Trump's mercurial. He still seems remarkably deferential to Putin, but there's no doubt that he suddenly sees Zelensky in a different light than he did before.
100%. And ever since that one day in the Oval Office, they're reporting that Lindsey Graham was starting to work on, okay, how are we going to repair this relationship? And I think Lindsey Graham deserves great credit for that. But I think also President Zelensky took advice not just of Graham, but other advisors on how to deal with Trump. A year and a half in, he understands President Trump better. As David said, President Trump likes a winner, and Zelensky, not just on the battlefield, but I really want to emphasize that innovation that the Ukrainians are responsible for, the tech innovation, the drone warfare that they're helping. Zelensky traveled out to the Gulf to talk to Gulf nations about how they could use that that drone technology developed by the Ukrainians that have been so successful on the battlefield. It's cheaper, it's easier to produce. And I think when you look at NATO, the question had always been, oh, should Ukraine be part of NATO? Now NATO is studying Ukraine as a lesson in innovation and how the Europeans can kind of innovate and develop more of their own independent strategic and defense autonomy. And so Zelensky is really coming in. I think both leaders understand each other better. But Zelensky, to go back to that one day in the Oval Office, Zelensky has cards, and he's playing them not just on getting the Patriots or the missiles, but also on licensing to produce that technology, which for Trump is, he thinks that the U.S. can make money on that.
Yeah, Zelensky has learned to read Trump so very well, manage that relationship. And now we're at the point where it's Putin who has to be mindful about the cost of war, both in terms of the economy and manpower there in Russia. All right.